We want to pick up with the increased political activity in Part 2. The most obvious effect of federalism is the mobilization of political activity. We have a decentralized system of authority in the federal system. That lowers the cost of organized political activity. A unitary system would raise the cost. Thus, we have widespread political activity that exists and is very organized at both the local, state, and national level. The founders were not very clear on how federalism was supposed to work. So as a result, we have decades of conflict that has occurred. So what can the states do? Well, the key role that the states have is the states have a key role in some particular areas. First of all, state constitutions are more detailed than federal constitutions. The federal constitution is based on a Republican, democratic principle. Laws are made by representatives of the citizens and not by citizens themselves. The state constitution permits a form of direct democracy, known as initiative, referendum, and also in some areas, recall. An initiative is a process that permits voters to put legislative measures directly on the ballot. A referendum is a procedure enabling voters to reject a measure passed by the legislature. And a recall is a procedure whereby voters can remove an elected official from office. In Ohio, we have initiative, referendum, but we do not have recall. Other areas, cities, towns, counties, really exist at the pleasure of the states. It's called home rule, and home rule in Ohio has been given to those cities, townships, and counties. Okay. What areas do the states play a key role in that the federal government also is involved in? Social welfare, public education, law enforcement, criminal justice, health and hospitals, roads and highways, and managing water supplies are really very much state functions, but in recent years in modern federalism, the government has become more involved in that. So what about federal-state relations? Sometimes what Washington lawfully may do may not be the same as what it politically may wish to do, and so that creates sometimes an issue. As a general rule, I'll give you a summary of this next section, which is contemporary politics of federalism, and then I'll be a little particular. The political dynamics of federalism have changed over the years. In the 20th century, the balance between state and federal power clearly tipped in favor of the national government. As early as the 1960s, Senator Everett Dirksen of Illinois warned that soon, quote, the only people interested in state boundaries will be Rand McNally, the map people, unquote. This concern exaggerated the extent to which the federal government can invade local prerogatives. The reason is that the constitutional structure forces members of Congress to remain focused on local issues, if only to achieve re-election. The shift to national control began in the late 19th century, but it was not until the growth of grant and aid programs during the 1960s that the symmetry of authority, the key to federalism, became relatively one-sided. As state and local governmental budgets became increasingly dependent on federal resources, the intergovernmental lobby, whereby local officials set up offices in Washington to compete for federal money, developed. The rivalry among states intensified when Congress began to loosen the strings of categorical grants and replace them with block grants based on distributional formulas. The absence of federal strings and the greater leeway in spending federal funds did not produce a corresponding increase in the freedom of local officials. First, creeping categorization occurred as the federal government began to disapprove of the way the states utilized block grants. Its response was to impose more restrictions on block grants. Second, categorical grants spawned state agencies and interest groups that relied on such grants for their survival. Because these groups frequently were successful in convincing congressional committees to preserve a particular grant from being merged into a larger block grant program, the result was to limit the overall number of block grants. And third, the ideological dimension of federalism became more prominent. Liberals, Democrats, and minority groups preferred to continue the practice of prescribing national standards as an antidote to the prejudices of local officials. Conservatives, Republicans, and business leaders preferred to transfer decision-making to the local level to avoid the inflexibility of national regulations. Thus, in the 1980s and early 1990s, stalemate developed as a Democratic Congress pushed in one direction while Republican administrations pushed in another. I think it's important at this point for you to have some definitions. A grant and aid is money given by the national government to the states. Okay. A block grant is money from the national government that states can spend within broad guidelines determined by Washington. A categorical grant is a federal grant for a specific purpose, such as building an airport. Conditions of aid are terms set by the national government that states must meet if they are to receive certain federal funds. This just gives you some idea of how much money comes from the federal government to the states. Federal aid and federal control are better known as mandates. We need to speak of mandates. A recent federal control on the activities of state governments is a mandate, a rule that tells states what they must do in order to comply with federal guidelines. Often the mandates are tied to federal grants, but sometimes the mandates have nothing to do with federal aid. Most mandates apply to civil rights and environmental protection. State programs may not discriminate against specific groups of people, no matter who pays for them. Today, anti-discrimination rules apply to race, sex, age, ethnicity, and physical and mental disabilities. States must comply with federal laws and standards regarding the environment as well. Mandates have been criticized strongly by state and local governments. From their point of view, it is easy enough for Congress to pass mandates when the states must foot the bills. For example, the 1986 Handicapped Children's Protection Act provided federal regulations meant to assure equal access and opportunity for disabled children. Federal guidelines included requirements for public schools to build access ramps and elevators, provide special buses and personnel, and widen hallways, all with no federal money to help schools comply. I've given you on that one sheet up where I gave you notes some examples of federal mandates for state and local governments. The 1983 Social Security Amendments, the 1984 Hazardous and Solid Waste Amendments, 1986 Handicapped Children's Protection Act, Safe Drinking Water Act, 1988 Drug-Free Workplace Acts, Ocean Dumping Ban Act, 1990 Clean Air Act Amendments, Americans with Disabilities Act. So this just gives you some idea of how important mandates have become and how much they have been criticized. We need to make a comment about devolution. By the mid-1990s, the pendulum began to swing back towards greater state authority. Two trends prompted this change. First, many states became frustrated by federal meddling in local affairs. In 1993, for example, the state of Hawaii refused to fly the American flag for an entire weekend as a sign of protest, and an active movement on behalf of secession emerged. Second, the increased level of professionalism in local governments encouraged states to experiment with new programs of their own. Congressional support for policy innovation resulted in lawmakers giving states greater authority over the federal welfare program. This divestiture of federal control led President Clinton to declare in 1996 that the era of big government was over. But his statement appears to have been premature. Recent federal expansions in Medicare coverage and the enactment of the No Child Left Behind funding program, complete with new state mandates, suggest that lawmakers today are more inclined to keep Washington in control of these programs. I think we need to also make some mention to bring this a little more up to date, okay? And that is, most Americans want to shift government programs to states, but not if that means cuts in government programs that benefit them. And it's not just low-income people. They don't want the hassle. They don't want their benefits cut, and they're afraid they'll lose benefits that other people have gotten and that they didn't get. Devolution has definitely resulted in more rules and regulations at both the federal and the state level. Welfare is your best example. Your textbook talks to you about the effect of devolution of welfare. There have been dramatic decreases in welfare rolls. The welfare to work programs, have they worked? We don't know. Not really. There's no real accurate quantitative information on that, especially since the 2007 recession hit. In 2007, we see more public and private partnerships at local levels increasing. But at the same time, okay, we see devolution, we see the interest in devolution and the devolution movement gaining momentum. Will it continue? With the economic problems we've had with the 2007 recession and the difference between the Republican and Democratic Party on their economic theories, that political and policy diversity is greater than at any other time in our history, and certainly greater than any other industrialized nation. Your textbook says politicians think of themselves as representatives of Washington to their localities and not as representatives of Washington to their localities. Okay? They don't necessarily look at their localities for the answer. They don't necessarily look at their constituents to guide them. We also know that members of Congress have different constituents, so not all laws passed by Congress favor all localities. Citizens differ in the extent to which they favor federal government or state, and much depends on the needs of individuals and their social situation. Sometimes, we've even seen now, and I think that this has come through in the news, we've definitely seen sometimes Congress not passing legislation simply because they don't like the person and the area or the geographic area that has sponsored the legislation. With the Affordable Care Act, are we seeing devolution? Or are we seeing the federal government becoming more a part of states' interests? I don't think the marble cake is gone. I think the marble cake is just changing. And I definitely think you should look at the advantages and disadvantages of federalism as it is today. It will continue to change, and the conflicts will continue, no matter who is president, all right, and no matter who is in Congress. The changes just may be different, okay, and the conflicts may be different.